In this video, we are finally going to build something that is a full application using our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript knowledge. So we're going to be building a little trivia application here that's going to be powered by some data from this trivia API that we'll take a look at in a second. So the final version that we'll build together will look something like this, where there'll be a question, you'll have some stats at the top of the screen, and then depending on whether you get the answer right or wrong, it will highlight in the appropriate color, give you some feedback, and then the next question will load. And if you get questions right, your score will go up as you're going through the game here. This is going to be the app that we're going to spend a number of weeks building together. We're starting with this basic version that is just in raw HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Then we will, once we get this version working, move over to the library that we'll be using for the rest of the semester called React, which gives us a better way to structure our user interface logic. And then when we get into databases and server-side programming, we'll essentially turn this into a quiz builder platform. So we'll be able to store players like high scores and their stats into a database, have them log in, but also have them able to create their own quizzes within the platform and share them publicly with other users. So I mentioned that roadmap because it's important to realize that we're building this in steps. So we're starting off now building it in just basic JavaScript to make sure that we have solid foundations in understanding JavaScript and understanding how to manipulate HTML and CSS through JavaScript before we move to React, which will it will give us a better way to structure our logic. But React is really just a JavaScript library. So if we don't understand JavaScript, we don't master building this version, then the React version won't make any sense. And then when we move into databases and server-side programming, if we don't have JavaScript and React under our belts solidly, then those won't make sense and we'll eventually be hamstringing ourselves if we miss one of these foundations. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we're going. If we get into React and you're struggling with something, you may not actually be struggling with a React concept. You may just be struggling with a fundamental JavaScript concept or a fundamental HTML or CSS concept. Okay, so I'm going to close this final version of the app and we're going to start in a blank version. So we're going to start in this version here. So we have I have my project open from the last video with a couple of files from the starter files that I'll have. So check the description to grab those. Basically, the assets that I'm giving you are a shuffle algorithm to take an array and randomize it, and a bunch of assets to style our page. So I'm not going to in this video go through all of the styling that's involved in building this version of our application. I really want to focus on the core programming logic, and we will dig deeper into that CSS, building CSS, when we get into React. But for this version, all you really need to understand is that you've brought in different CSS classes here that we need to apply at the appropriate places. So like our class here, trivia item question, that defines this styling on our page. So we want to make sure that we align that with where that content is in our HTML. All right, so make sure you've got that CSS and the shuffle.js from the starter files. And the other thing you want to make sure that you have is the JSON formatter Chrome extension, which we'll be using later when we look at some JavaScript data in the browser. So make sure you're in Chrome, make sure you've got that installed. Before we get started, I want to flip back to the whiteboard and outline what we're going to do for building this quiz trivia game. So a couple steps that I want to go through in this video. One, I want to get a version working that just uses prompts. So prompt version game. Basically, this cuts out the HTML and CSS so that all we have to think about is the core JavaScript logic. Once we've got that version working, what I want to do is work on the HTML and CSS. So for this step, we're basically working out the view of our application, taking an individual question, getting it on the page, and then once we've got that working, we can head to step 3, which is real version of game. And by real here, I mean the version that is actually hooked up to our user interface in HTML and CSS. All right, let's get started. So we're going to start with that prompt version of the game. And what I'm going to do is inside of my JavaScript folder, I have a quiz game folder. That is where my shuffle.js is. And in this folder, that's where I'm going to place all of my files related to this quiz game. So I'm going to create a new file here, prompt game version, version.js. And into this, we're going to practice a couple of things. I want to just quickly review basic arrays and loops. Then I want to dive into how could we store questions into an array. And then lastly, we will figure out the trivia game in prompts. And the reason why we're talking about arrays and loops here, if it's not already clear, if I go back to my version of the game, here we go. We're loading 10 questions here. So we've got all of this in array as data, and then we will render it. In this prompt version, we're going to render it with prompts, but in the final version, we'll render it with HTML. So we're displaying one version from that, one question from that array, and then when we get the answer right, we move on to the next version, the next question in that array, pull that out, display it, and so forth. Next question in the array, continuing to go forward. Okay, so we've got to make sure that we understand arrays and loops before we can actually start building this out. So I'm going to create a player scores array here. So let's say we're storing how the player did on a trivia game. And let's pretend maybe there are 15 questions in this version. So this is the player's history of scores that they've gotten. This is just an array of 5 elements, 5 numbers. And remember, arrays can be mixed type in JavaScript. Here, it just happens that they're all numbers. Once we have that, we can use a structure that will be familiar to you from other programming languages, a for loop, to go through that array. So what this loop is doing is starting a variable called I at 0, making it go until we are, as long as we are less than the length of player scores, and the length here is how many elements are there. So we've got 5 elements. And after the loop runs, here's our incrementer that takes the I variable up from the previous value up 1. So if I console log score I is player scores I. And let's make sure that we are importing this file, prompt game version, into our index.js. And then make sure that we've got this open in live server, which I already have. We should be able to open up our console here and see score 0 is 12, score 1 is 13, 2 is 11, 3 is 9, 4 is 13. So the I here is our index, is our location in the array, and in JavaScript, arrays are 0-based, which means that the first element, if we want to grab that first score, we have to say player scores 0. First score So now we can see first score 12, and if we did player scores 1 here, that would be our second score. Second score is 13, all the way up to 2, 3, 4. This would be our last one. So what our loop is doing is just creating a variable that goes from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And we are pulling out that player scores using our bracket notation here and passing in our loop variable, our I variable. So this isn't the only way that we can write loops inside of JavaScript. Another way that we can write a loop is the for of loop. So we can say for const score of player scores console.log score. The for of structure here allows us to create a variable that is filled in one at a time with each of the values from our array. So we can see 12, 13, 11, 9, 13 running. Anytime you have an iterable, you can use this for of structure. We can also use a functional approach to this, where we define a function, print score, and it's going to take in a score, an index, and it could also take in a third parameter called array. And we console log score, score index. So arrays in JavaScript have a number of functions associated with them that allow you to perform an action for the elements in your array. So for each allows us to pass in a function that takes in these 3 parameters, and it is going to run this function for each element in the array. So here we go. We can see score 0 is 12, 13, 11, 9, 13. So all 3 of these loops gave us access to the elements that are inside the array. You may see any of these structures in code going forward. A couple of things to keep in mind. This one, we don't have access to the index by default. We would have to go ahead and keep track of the index ourselves if we wanted to know which score we were printing out. And one thing to note about this version is that you can't exit the for each early with a break statement. Okay, so that's it. Basic arrays, loops. Let's move on to something that's a little closer to what we're doing in this application. So what I'm going to do is comment out this code so that it's not running. And I want to create a new array, but this time it will be questions. So I'm going to save myself some typing and just copy some questions over here. And whoops, this should be brackets. So here, as opposed to our array up here that had number values for each element in this array is an object, and each object has a text property and an answer property. So we can reach in and we can grab this text, display it to the user, and check their answer to see if they got it right or wrong. I'm going to go ahead and use the for each structure with this array. So question, let's call this plural questions, questions.forEach. And instead of creating a separate function, I'm just going to create an arrow function inline here. And that arrow function will take a score and an index. And we could also say that it takes an array, but we're going to ignore that parameter. We don't really need it, even though for each provides it for us. So let's just get this running by, let's console log. Oh, what am I doing? This should not be score. This should be question. So we're looping through this array. We're pulling out each object into this question variable, and we've also got the index available to us. So let's just print this information out. We can see that when we print out an object, it actually gives us this interactive user interface here where we can expand the object to see that it has properties within it. And here's our index. So this is looking like it's working. Let's print out question.text instead of the question. Good. We can see the questions printing out here. And let's do the same thing with answer. We can see the question and the answer printing out. Question, answer. So what we're going to do is prompt by displaying the text and getting from that prompt the user's response and compare that against the answer to see if they got it right or wrong. So let's do this. The player's answer is equal to prompt question.text. If the player answer is equal to answer, then they got it right. So we can alert correct. Otherwise, we can alert wrong. And if we save this and flip back, we should see, here's our modal. Can an octopus fit through any hole bigger than its beak? Let's get it right with yes. Whoops. And I've made a mistake here. So that was a runtime error. And it's telling me answer is not defined here because instead of player answer equals answer, it should be question.answer because we're referring to this property that's within our question object. Let's try that again. Let's get it right. Yes. Is the national animal of Scotland the unicorn? Let's get this one right. Yes. And then bleach never expires. Let's get this one wrong. So we'll put in yes, wrong. Good. It looks like the basic version is working here. One thing that is common to do is when you have an object and you have these properties within it, you kind of want to shorthand instead of saying question.text everywhere. Maybe you just want to have a local variable called text. So you could do question text is question.text. Answer is question.answer. So this is still working. I can say yes and no here and get them right and wrong. And there's an even shorter way to express this. We can just do object destructuring. So if we have a property in an object that we want to pull out into a variable of the same name, so we want to take this question.text and put it into a text variable, and question.answer and put it into an answer variable, we can just do this. Text answer equals question. This is going to do the same thing as these previous two lines. And what we need to make sure we do is then comment out these two lines because we can't declare text variable twice here. We can't do the same thing with answer. We can't have two const answer equals. So I'm going to comment those out. And this should still work. Let's get that right. Good. Okay, so that's our basic version here. A couple of other things to note is that we are using equals, equals, equals to compare. In JavaScript, when you compare two things, you can use 3 equal signs. This is strict equality, and that's my recommendation that you always use the strict equals. You can do 2 equal signs to do a comparison where JavaScript will actually try to convert the things that you give it to the same type before you do a comparison. So if you give it a number and a string, it's going to try and convert them to a common type before comparing them. That can lead to a lot of bugs that you don't expect. So it's better to just use the strict equality comparison here. Okay, so we've got our array of questions. We can loop over them. We can check whether they're right or wrong. This is getting close to our final version of our application. But if we look at it, we can see that it's a question followed by a couple of answers. So this is not quite what we want. So what I'm going to do is comment this out. And let's go full screen here to check out the API that we're going to be using. So API just stands for Application Programming Interface. This is a trivia API, so you can ask for a URL to be generated using these settings. And once you do that, you can go to your browser and see a bunch of questions that are generated from that API. And I have the formatter installed, so you can see I've got the raw version and the parsed version. And your life will be a lot easier if you have this formatter, so you can check out the parsed version, which gives you the ability to kind of explore by expanding and contracting through the hierarchy here. This file that we have is called JSON. That's the file format. It's a lightweight data format, and it's JSON is short for JavaScript object notation. So it's very similar to what we've seen when we're declaring a literal object in JavaScript, where it starts with our opening curly, closes with our closing curly, and then it has these properties that have values associated with them. JSON is a little bit different from JavaScript objects in that all of the property names have to be in double quotes, and then the values have a reduced subset of possibilities. Like you can't just put JavaScript in here. It has to be a number, a string, a Boolean, an array, for an example of some of the possible values. So what I want to do here is I just want to flip back. Maybe I want 3 questions from the board game category. And I want to make sure that these are multiple choice, not true false, because this API supports answers that are multiple choice with 4 possibilities or true false with 2 possibilities. So once I do that, I will generate the new URL here, paste it into my browser, and see a smaller subset. So we're getting a question about Monopoly, Dice Tower, Magic the Gathering. I'm going to grab this array. So I'm starting at the results property value. So this opening bracket, this closing bracket, I'm going to copy that and paste it into my file here. Prettier will kick in and format it. And at the start of this line, I want to say my trivia items are equal to this array. So now what I want to do is the same logic where we were looping over our questions and printing them out, except that I want to do that with our more complicated set of data here. So each item in our array is an object, and they have the same structure. So they all have a category field, which here is all tagged with board games because that's the category I chose. The type, which tells me it's multiple choice. The difficulty, this one's easy, this one's hard, this one's medium. The question, so this will be what we present to the user. The correct answer, and then 3 incorrect answers in an array. Same structure for this one, same structure for this one. So let's just try looping over the trivia array and see if we can grab the question, correct answer, and incorrect answers. So I'm going to use the trivia items for each. Again, this is an array, so we have this for each option, and I'm going to pass in an arrow function that is going to accept the trivia item and the index. So to get started, let's just print out trivia item dot question and maybe trivia item dot correct answer. So there we go. We can see the Monopoly question, brown, Dice Tower question, and the Magic question. So I'm going to get tired of typing trivia item dot question, trivia item dot correct answer everywhere. So I'm just going to do this with destructuring. So I'm just pulling out the question property into a variable with the same name, correct answer, with the variable with the same name, incorrect answer, again, same exact name. So these names of our variables have to match those property names. And now I should be able to print out question, correct answer, incorrect answer, and see them over here. Monopoly, brown, and then our array of 3 incorrect answers. So the first thing that I want to do is take my incorrect answers and my correct answer and shuffle them together so that I have an array of 4 things that we can present as the answers to the question, like we've got here, but so they're shuffled so that the correct answer isn't always the first one in that array. So this is where that shuffle utility comes in that I gave you. So make sure your shuffle is next to your prompt game version file. And this is a function that takes in an array and returns to you a shuffled copy of that array. This uses the export syntax. So when we import this file, we are going to get to name this function as we're importing it in our file. So if we flip back to our prompt game version and we head to the top of our file where we put our imports, we are taking whatever is exported from shuffle and importing it as this name, shuffle. We could import it as whatever name we want in this case, so we could call it shuffle array instead of shuffle, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to name this shuffle. So if I come down here, I want to pass into shuffle a new array that has the correct answer and incorrect answers in it. If I just pass it the incorrect answers, and let's print out in all answers here, we can see blue, yellow, green this time, yellow, green, blue, green, yellow, blue. So it's shuffling those incorrect answers, but we want to make sure that the correct answer is in there. There are a number of ways to do this in JavaScript. I'm going to go for a shorthand here called the spread operator. So I'm taking the correct answer, I'm specifying it as the first element of a new array, and then I'm using the spread operator to say, hey, take everything in this array, the incorrect answers array, and just spread it into our array. So we end up with 4 items in this new array, the correct answer, followed by each of the 3 incorrect answers. So if I run it again, brown, green, yellow, blue, so brown is our correct answer, and if we refresh it, we should see brown hopping around to random positions. So it looks like we got our shuffled answers. So what I want to do now is prompt the user. So I want to create some question text here. I'm going to use a template string. And let's do question number. We'll put in the index. And let's put a placeholder here for what the score would be. And then let's put the question. And then on the next line, we can put all of our answers. And then prompt the user with that question text. So we can see question 0, score 0 in a standard game of Monopoly. What colors are the 2 cheapest properties? Yellow, blue, brown, green. And if I hit enter, it should show me the next one and then the next one. So you may have wondered how we passed in an array here to a string and it was able to format it. And that's because by default, JavaScript will handle conversions of an array to a string by calling toString on each element and joining it with a comma. We can actually use the join method of the array to go ahead and take our answers and join them with a comma and then a space. So now they're blue space. There's spaces between each of these answers. And we could also instead join them with like a pipe, blue, green, yellow, brown. Okay, and then the last piece here to match what we did here was compare to see whether we got the answer right or wrong. So player answer is equal to the result of this prompt. If the player answer is equal to our correct underscore answer, then we can go ahead and display an alert that says like correct, otherwise alert wrong, and we can try playing it now. So question 0, score 0, which of these? Let's go ahead and get this one right and check if it prints out the right answer or prints out correct. So we see correct. This one, I don't even remember the answer to, so Tom is the answer. Let's try Borth Samson and get wrong. And then in magic, 6th color, let's try getting this one right, purple. And don't worry about this ampersand quote semicolon that's around Magic the Gathering. This is an HTML escape code. When we get to actually displaying this on the page, we won't have this problem where we see this weird HTML. We will actually get it displaying properly on the page. Let's make one small tweak here. Let's actually track the score. So let's create a score variable that's set to 0 and insert that in here to our text. And then when we get it right, we can go ahead and take the score and add 1 to it. So now to test it, let's try getting some of these right. So the first answer here should be brown. Correct. Our score goes up by 1. Let's try getting this one wrong to make sure that the score doesn't go up. Wrong, score stays the same, and let's get the last one right. Well, actually, we're not going to be able to see the final score because we don't have anything that prints out after the correct, but that should be working fine. So this is the heart of what we need to do in our final version. The key difference is that we're not going to be using prompt, and our logic is not going to be synchronous in the same way that it's synchronous here. So basically, when this is running, we prompt, lock the screen, and then when that prompt finishes, we can check if the answer was right or wrong. You can't do that with real interactive HTML. We can't block the page here. So we actually need to wait till someone clicks on one of these before we can run our, check to see whether they were correct or wrong. So what I want to do is let's definitely get these alerts off the page. So I'm going to go back to index. And now that this is working, we're going to keep it for reference, but we can comment that out. So now it shouldn't be running on every page. What I want to do is flip back to our index, so our home page here. And this is no longer going to be our home page. This is where we actually want to display our questions. And our user interface for our game is going to have this stats bar at the top that'll have the score, the level, the questions. It'll then have the question text and then 4 buttons that are interactive here that the user can click on. So for this to just speed through the process a bit, what I want to do is let's build the stats, build an example question, and then move it to a template. This is going to be our kind of roadmap for what we're going to do here. And for each of these, we're going to use a lot of classes that I've just included for you, so make sure that you've got them in your CSS. like my stats, here are our classes for our stats that will style the stats that we put on the page. And then here are classes for our trivia items that we will put on the page. It's not a lot of CSS. There are a lot of new properties in here. I recommend checking them out, spending some time, at least acknowledging what's in here so that you are storing them in the back of your head for future reference. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them in this video. So what I want to do is create this stats container. So it's going to be 3 elements here that are side by side, and for elements that are next to one another, like this in a list, we will often reach for a list element. And even though this doesn't look like the list elements that we created previously, like these emoji ones, or the bulleted list that you get by default, we're just going to change the styling so that they look like this. So my recommendation is to close your bookmarks bar or your file explorer bar, and bring up your browser side by side with VS Code so that you can see the output of our HTML. So I'm going to create an unordered list here. I'm going to create a list item, and let's put 0 in here. Put score 0. Let's put level 1. And let's put question 1 of 10, or however many we're going to include in the application. So this is our default styling, and we want to apply some classes to it to get this looking like our styling here. So inside of that stats.css, I have a stats class that here is restyling that list so that it's showing up horizontally without those bullets. And then for each item, there's a class stats underscore stats dash label. That we want up to apply here. Oh, not stats label. This is stat label. So let me show you here. Stats, that is our styling for our container. And then stats label here. Oh, you know what? I did this, now that I'm looking at it, I did this wrong here. So this isn't our label. This is our container. Now that looks right. Okay, so we've got our stats. That takes our list and formats it horizontally. We've got our container, which is giving us some things like the background color and the font styling. And then the last bit here is that if we look at the final app, we kind of want to have a label above the number and sort of de-emphasize the label and emphasize the number. So we need to style this separately from this, and that's where these 2 classes come in. Our label styles the score, and the value styles the number. So if we flip back to our index, what we want is, let's make this a little bigger. Instead of score 0, we need 2 elements so that we can style the score text separate from the 0. So I'm going to grab a div and put the score text in that. And this is our stats underscore stat dash label. And you can see now that we've applied it, that text shrinks, and let's do dash value and put the number 0 in there. And I just removed the extra 0. So that's looking like how we intended in the CSS. I'm going to copy and paste this and put it in here and say level 1. and question 1 of 10. So this is looking like our final version. One thing that I want to point out is this naming convention that I'm using is called BEM. It's a block element modifier. So when you think about designing larger chunks of CSS, you often want to use a rule to help you name them consistently and avoid naming collisions. So like if I just called this class label for my score, it's possible that many things on my site might have a class of label on them. Like I have a form with a bunch of labels and I use label there. That would be bad because we'd have conflicting CSS. So BEM is one of those naming conventions that you can use where you think of the block, like what's the whole thing that we're working with here, stats, and then 2 underscores separate the name of the block from the actual element within it. So this is our stat container within stats, and this is our stat label within stats, and stat value within stats. So this block element modifier naming convention helps us avoid naming collisions across our site with CSS. When we get to JavaScript, there are some ways that we can just like leave this behind and allow JavaScript to take care of making sure that our names are unique. But for now, this is what we're using. So one thing that we do need here for our stats to make sure that we can actually make this stuff interactive is we need some way to get it this number, and this number/number from our code. And one of the easy ways to do that is to make an ID or to add an ID to the element that contains each of those things. So this div has our score, so we can call this ID score. This has our level, so we could say ID level. And this has our question number, so we could call this ID question dash number. So we should be able to, in our JavaScript, now reach in and modify each of those things from code when the time comes. Great. So we've got our BEM for our stats. Our stats are done. We got this first one completed. So now we can move on to building an example question. And same deal, I will kind of walk through, point out some of the CSS we're using, but not spend a lot of time talking about it. And we'll get to designing CSS later, or designing it from scratch later. So here what we want is we want this text to show up big and bold on the page, and then we want our questions to show up underneath it, or our answers to the question to show up in these buttons that are already styled. So beneath our stats, but still inside of our main element on the page, I'm going to create a div. This is going to be our container for all of the trivia questions that we put on the page. So I'm going to put an ID on this of trivia container. This will make sense when we get into the JavaScript, but basically when the time comes, we're going to clear out this container, put a question into it, and then when they get it right or wrong, we'll clear it out again, put a new question into it, and keep going, so forth. So this is like our spot that we're going to mount things from JavaScript. So then inside of this, I can add a question. So here, let's use, I still have the API open. You know what, to make it easier, I'm just going to copy from what we've got here already in our JavaScript. So in a standard game of Monopoly, what are the properties? That's showing up on the page here. And let's go full screen to make this easier. So we'll come back and we'll bring them side by side in a second. I just want everyone to be able to see everything on the page. So we've got a paragraph, and then again, we've got a series of elements sequentially on the page, so it makes sense to put them into a list. So I'm going to create an unordered list, and into each of these, I'm going to create a list item. So each of these is one of our answers. So then I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste. Well, actually, I can just memorize these. Brown, green, yellow, blue. Brown, green, yellow, blue. Give that a save. Check out our page. So we've got our text showing up, 4 options showing up, except that these aren't clickable. So these should be buttons. So then what I want to do is go in here and create a button element around the word brown and do the same thing. I'm just copy and pasting to go quickly here. Move the green into a button, move the yellow into a button, and the blue into a button. There we go. So brown, green, yellow, blue. They're ugly buttons, but they are buttons. So that is working. So now we can take this ugly default styling and apply some of the styling that I have provided for you in trivia item. So the first one here is trivia item question. So for all of these, the block, the element that we're using in our BEM styling, our BEM styling, is trivia item, and then each of these has a name for the element. So it's trivia item question, trivia item answers, trivia item button. So let's bring this side by side so that we can see the classes being applied. So trivia item question. There we go. The text jumps up in size. Let's do trivia item answers. So trivia item answers, trivia item question is pretty short. It's just the alignment and the size. Trivia item answers uses the grid styling to go ahead and create a grid that is 2 by 2 for these buttons. But the buttons aren't styled yet. So let's apply the button styling. Actually, let's apply, I actually have some styling here for the list item. Let's apply that first. Trivia item answer. And let's take a look here. Oh, you know what? That is a class that doesn't exist. I need to update my solution. We don't need to style that list item. We just need to style our buttons here with a class of trivia item button. And now we've got our 4 buttons showing up. So that trivia item button styling is changing how the buttons are displayed, including their color, their font size, their border, and it's adding some styling for when the buttons are hovered to change the color and rotate the button. It also, if I hit tab through my page, changes the focus styling, the outline around them, and then it provides a couple of longer class names here that we'll use when we get into the CSS, but there's a disabled version, a correct version, and an incorrect version. If I just grab this class and apply it after my default styling here, so I've got my regular button and then I've added so this is the block, this is the element, and this is the modifier, the disabled version of that button. You can see it shows up in a grayed out color. And the correct version shows up in green, incorrect shows up in red. So we're going to be able in JavaScript, when the user interacts with this, to use those classes to change our buttons. So we can disable all of them except for the correct one, the one that they got, or the correct or incorrect one, the one that they clicked on. So now that we have mapped out an example question on the page, we want to not actually put this on the page when the page loads, but use JavaScript to inject this onto the page. So this paragraph should come from our data that we had previously stored here in an array. So grab this, put it on the page, put this into our buttons. And then when they get that right or wrong, clear the page, put this on the page, and put these into our buttons. So one mechanism that's useful in modern HTML is that we can actually, instead of creating an element directly on the page like this, we can put it into what's called a template. And when we put it into a template, it doesn't render on the page to the user, but we are able to reach into it from JavaScript and use it. So basically, we want to create a template of this div that we can copy and paste onto the page from JavaScript. We can clone it, add it to the page, and then modify it, fill it in with the appropriate question and answer. So what I want to do is I'm going to put this after my footer, create a template element. And just to show you it, if I put an H1 that says hi and go back to our page, that doesn't show up anywhere on our page. So what I can do is grab this div that has our question. Whoops, I took one too many tags. I want this div. So I want to leave the div for the trivia container and the closing to it and just grab the div that's inside of it. So this is now gone from the page, but we could clone this template and put it onto the page ourselves. As far as the template goes, we don't really want this content in there anymore, so I'm going to get rid of the text in our paragraph and the contents of our button. So we've essentially got an empty element here that is ready to be cloned and filled in and put on our page. And let's add a note. We will insert a clone of the template here from JS. The last thing that we need to do on this page is give ourselves an ID on this template. And that is so that we can, from JavaScript, grab this template. All right, let's look back at our whiteboard here. We built the prompt version of our game. We got the HTML and CSS up and running so that things looked right. We're going to cut this video off here, and in the next video, we will actually finish this out by taking our prompt version of the game and updating it to use that user interface that we just created.